It's believed that the spirit of a baby witch haunts the Pilot Knob Cemetery in Marion, Kentucky. What's even more unsettling are the claims that something sinister is haunting her. One of the graves inside Pilot Knob Cemetery is filled with rock and surrounded by a white fence made of interlocking crucifixes. The grave belongs to Mary Evelyn Ford and has an interesting and disturbing legend attached to it. In the late 1800s, a woman and her 5-year-old daughter were accused of witchcraft by the Pilot Knob townsfolk, and for this alleged crime, the mother and daughter paid with their lives. Most of the stories claim that no one knows where the mother's remains were taken after her demise, but in reality, they may be buried right there in the same graveyard in a normal-looking grave, not too far away from Mary Evelyn. This makes the strange precautions of the little girl's grave all the more unusual, but according to multiple witnesses, the precautions are needed. Mary Evelyn's unrest spirit has been spotted pacing around inside the fence, sometimes reaching out to visitors, possibly in an attempt to coerce them into freeing her from her eternal resting place. This story is indeed a sad one, but for people who have visited Pilot Knob Cemetery, it's just as much a tale of fright. Witnesses claim that they've discovered child-sized footprints on the ground near Mary Evelyn's grave, heard her voice, and some people have even seen an apparition of a little girl in a white dress standing inside the fence, beckoning to them. One story in particular claims the iron bars that surround her grave are bent, as if someone tried to crawl through them. Throughout the years, there have been claims of crosses appearing in the tree, some of which are inverted, and also that there's just this general sense of being stalked or watched or followed while you're there. Another claim attached to this location states that if you cross over the fence and lie down on top of Mary Evelyn's grave, she'll try to pull you into the ground. Now, if all that isn't spooky enough, there is a second entity lurking on the cemetery grounds, and this entity is known as the Watcher. And there are plenty of theories on the identity of this shadowy figure. Some say it's a type of wraith who stalks Mary Evelyn, trying to steal her soul. Others think it might be protecting her from curious graveyard visitors, or even other entities who might wish to do her harm. Have you ever encountered Mary Evelyn or the Watcher? Leave me a comment and let me know. And don't forget to follow for more spooky stuff. Did you know the only witch burned in the United States was a Kentucky witch? Her name was Leah Smock, and she lived in the area that would eventually become Meade County. Leah was born in the year 1818, and historical sources claim that not only was she a powerful witch, but her mother was a witch as well, though little is known about her. Leah died young, but in her tragically short life, she was able to make a name for herself as someone who possessed great strengths and intelligence. It was believed that she had both healing powers and the gift of psychic mediumship. She was well known in her community for her seemingly magical abilities, and as the legend goes, Leah's predictions were frequent and accurate. Then in August of 1840, a group of superstitious locals banded together and ambushed Leah, locking her in a smokehouse on her father's property and setting it on fire. Leah perished at only 22 years old. The girl's remains were buried at Elizabeth Daly Graveyard near Battletown. Some folks have reported seeing mounds of stones piled atop her grave, presumably a gesture of fear for Leah's abilities even in death. Others claim they have seen Leah herself in spirit form roaming the forest, enshrouded in a purple aura-like haze. Have you ever been to the forest around Battletown? Did you see anything weird? Leave me a comment and let me know, and don't forget to follow for more spooky stuff. Have you ever heard the story about how the Spurlington Tunnel is both cursed and filled with treasure? The Spurlington Tunnel of Campbellsville, Kentucky doesn't just look spooky from the outside. There's a legend attached to it that is downright gruesome, and yet somehow still enticing enough to make you want to go spelunking. In the late 1800s, Jesse James and his gang were fresh off of a train robbery and loaded down with loot when they found themselves in the community of Spurlington, needing to unburden themselves of the heavy stolen load of silver and gold. They found a newly dug tunnel and decided to hide their stash inside, but they'd soon come to realize there was a witness. Nancy Bass, or Aunt Nancy as some people knew her, was believed to be a witch. She lived nearby and happened upon the gang in action. This, of course, did not go well for either party involved. When the men noticed her noticing them, They took her life and buried her alongside the stolen goods. Now, there are actually a couple of variations of this story. One claims that Aunt Nancy, the witch, provided shelter and care for the gang until they turned on her, eventually murdering her to ensure her silence. This variation claims she threatened the gang with a curse if they hurt her, while the other variation states she instead cursed the tunnel and the loot itself, as well as anyone who dared to dig up the buried treasure. To this day, some folks believe there's truly buried treasure in Spurlington Tunnel, but if there is, does that mean Aunt Nancy the witch is guarding it, ready to curse anyone who goes looking for it? If you're from Appalachian, Kentucky, you might have heard stories about knocking spirits. There are even superstitions involving knocking spirits, like the one that says hearing someone knock when no one is around is a sign of coming death in the family. But did you know that knocking spirits were also sometimes used as a form of divination? As a kid growing up in Appalachian, Kentucky in the 80s and 90s, I spent most of my time around elderly folks. I loved hearing their stories or superstitions, but what I really loved was their perspective on the paranormal. One of the most fascinating stories I heard as a kid was about an old witch who lived nearby and could predict the future using only a simple plank of wood. The old woman lived back in a holler just over the hill from where I grew up, in a big old rundown house that had been standing since probably the 1800s. In her older years, she spent most of her time as a shut-in, but once in a while you'd see her out walking through the neighborhood. My mom would always say she was out carrying tales, meaning that, of course, she was out spreading gossip from house to house. She was a very mysterious and even sometimes controversial person who had lived a long, interesting life. But what I found most fascinating was how the community perceived her as someone who had some kind of supernatural abilities. As a kid, I'd ask the old people I visited to tell me scary or weird stories because those were my favorite. And for some of them, stories of her were the first thing that came to mind. They'd recall encounters with her that didn't make sense in the normal way of things, like how she sometimes seemed to know about things before they happened, or she knew about things she shouldn't know about. And quite often she would venture out of the holler to warn people, but the warning always came dressed in a disguise of general concern. All of that started to make more sense after one of the old neighbor ladies told me a story about how the witch could talk to ghosts. This old lady told me about how when she was a younger woman, she and her friends would take the horses late at night and ride up the holler to the witch's house. The witch would put on a pot of coffee and pull out this wooden plank she kept tucked away in her cabinets next to her pots and pans, and then they'd all gather around the kitchen table. The witch would start to talk to the spirits, guiding them closer and closer, and finally she'd take the guests' questions. The only rule was it had to be something that could be answered with a yes or a no. Then the spirits would start responding, one knock on the wood plank for yes, and two knocks for no. The old woman told me that the predictions from these late night knocking ghost sessions would always come true. The twist at the end of this story, I suppose, is that this witch was actually my great aunt. And many years after hearing and falling in love with this story, I went hunting for knocking spirits myself, and I think I found one at one point. But that's a whole other story. Let me know if you want to hear that. It was also my first experience with a Ouija board. So what are your thoughts on knocking spirits? Have you ever tried to communicate with one? Leave me a comment and let me know, and don't forget to follow for more spooky stuff. There's a holler in McCreary County that holds a mysterious legend about a witch. Very little's known about this legend, but something about it makes it very fascinating. The Barren Fork Cemetery is located deep in the woods of Whitley City, Kentucky, and is the home of the story of Anna Foster. According to the story, Anna was a witch. Variations of the story imply that her passing had something to do with her practice, but the stories never clarify, and no one seems to know how or why she died. People who have visited the Barren Fork Cemetery claim that as soon as you drive onto the rural road leading out to the forest, the temperature drops, even in the summer heat. A lot of people believe this to be a well-established indicator of paranormal activity. But the strangest part of the story claims that within this cemetery is a house, sometimes referred to as Grandma's house, built around the grave of the alleged witch. This detail adds a peculiar and fascinating element to the story because one can't help but wonder, why would anyone go to such lengths? Was it because someone felt they needed to keep the witch contained, even in death? Weirder still are the claims that someone or something inside the structure has been known to lock the doors, sometimes even when you're inside. Upon researching this location and talking to various sources and first-hand witnesses, I've discovered that a lot of these details aren't entirely accurate and some of them are jumbled at best. While it is true that a woman named Anna Foster is buried here, her grave isn't located inside of an out-of-place house. It's right out in the open with the rest of the graves. In fact, there is no house, though many people claim there is and it's just hidden somewhere in the woods nearby, curiously separated from everything else. Anna's grave also hasn't been destroyed. However, her headstone once donned a sitting lamb, and it is true that the effigy of the animal has been decapitated in what appears to be a very deliberate way. So where did this story come from? What was Anna's significance in the town of Whitley City? Is there a lost piece of history here that might make the whole thing make more sense? And perhaps most importantly, if Anna's buried in the graveyard alongside all the other town folk, who's buried in the lonesome grave out in the woods?